Okay, let's start, shall we? Let's start with let's listen to what Bill Maher has to say about um, Chapel Roan and Israel Palestine in general.
And finally, new rule: to mark the October 7th anniversary, we must launch a campaign to educate young Americans about the Middle East. And the way I'd like to begin that process is by addressing an open letter to Chapel Roan. Now, first off, the fact that you don't know much history isn't your fault. You live in the United States, where the schools stopped doing that whole teaching facts thing a while ago. But getting all your history from TikTok is like getting all your calories from Hostess. My guess is that Gen Z hearts are hardened by the propaganda you see on TikTok, which likes to call the Jews colonizers. But colonizers are intruders who have no history in an area, like when Spain conquered the Mayans, or when your mom took over Facebook. When the Dutch took over South Africa, they had no history to the land. They just wanted it. But Israel is the Jews' homeland, and Jews have always lived there. I cap you not. You can look it up. It's in this book called The Bible, which is horribly wrong about sex ed, slavery, science, and cooking, but the archaeology checks out. It says the Jews built a temple with a really big wall 7 centuries before Muhammad or Islam ever existed, and sure as shit, you can still go there and touch it. Calling Jews colonizers in Israel is like calling Native Americans colonizers here. It's ridiculous.
This comparison to Native Americans very much misconstrues what was going on in Palestine after the emergence of Zionism as an ideology. So for that comparison to make sense, then you would need to imagine a Native American community, an indigenous community, that engages in something similar to what Zionist Jews did in Palestine. And that's just, it's never happened. Right, so picture this for a moment. The Seminole people are the indigenous people originally indigenous to Central Florida. And during the Trail of Tears, they were evicted from their lands, forcefully evicted, and sent to Oklahoma. Now, imagine a nationalist, ultra-nationalist Seminole movement appears today. And their argument is that they want to return to their historical lands in Central Florida. But, I mean, this is not a call to just simply return to Florida and live there with their own way of life and as move en masse there. What they want, what these hypothetical peoples would say that, remember, don't exist, is that they want to remove the entire population of Central Florida. So Tampa and Orlando, cities of like 300,000 people each, need to be evacuated, expulsed from Central Florida, because that area has to be exclusively Seminole. And then areas that were beyond that specific area that they're going to, let's say Miami, they are going to occupy it, and then they're going to send Seminole people to live in Miami suburbs, while they subject Miamians to military rule. Right? That would need to happen. Something like that would need to happen for Bill Maher to be able to say, yeah, it's silly to compare Native Americans, silly to compare Jews to colonizers, because then you would need to call Native Americans colonizers as well. It would be silly to say that Native Americans are colonizers. But that's the thing. Native Americans aren't colonizing. Right? In fact, most of the proposals by indigenous peoples in the Americas about how to conduct decolonization after the end of colonialism are not based on ethnic cleansing. The proposals by indigenous people to decolonize do not imply going to New York and removing everyone who isn't indigenous from New York and replacing them with indigenous people. That's just not what decolonization means in the context of indigeneity in the Americas. If you read Fausto Reinaga, for example, he's the author of a book called The Indian Revolution. Um, he um, he calls for the decolonization of Bolivia. Bolivia understood as this like westernized state, right? That has two nations, more than two nations, but two big nations inside: the Spaniard descendant white population and the Aymara indigenous population. And his proposal is not, oh, you know what, we should expel everyone who's white from Bolivia and create an only indigenous Aymara state. No, his proposal is we need to accept the multicultural nature, the plurinational nature of Bolivia. And so Aymaras and white descendants from Spaniards need to be equal, because right now they are not. Right now there's a colonial relation between the indigenous peoples of Bolivia and white Bolivians. That is an actual call by an Aymara on how a Western state should decolonize, right? And um, that's not ethnic cleansing, right? So what these peoples are asking is that in the areas where they have actual indigenous communities, that their traditions are respected. But no one is asking for ethnic cleansing. So the comparison between Native Americans and Zionist colonialists in Palestine is off, is very off, because it would be absurd to call Native Americans colonialists because Native Americans are not colonizing. Whereas Zionist Jews did specifically say that they were going to Palestine to colonize Palestine. Okay, so shall we go on with the video, guys? Here's the next point that Maher makes, okay?
Chappell, did you know that for 2,000 years, Palestine was like an Uber driver with a 3-star rating? Nobody wanted it. And there was never any Arab country called Palestine. It was an orphan province. And if you ask people what they thought about it back then, they'd say it gave them the ick. But after World War II, and after the Jews were very nearly wiped out by an actual attempted genocide, they decided it was time for their historic homeland to be an actual country, so that for once they could defend themselves.
Okay, so here's the thing. Bill Maher claims that Palestine was this orphan province, allegedly therefore in search for a father or in search for parents, and that nobody wanted it. I guess the people who lived there didn't want it. It's a funny argument to make, right? It's a pretty egregious erasure of the people who actually lived there, right, at the time. But it is a common colonial trope. So it's ironic that he would say this is my defense as to why it's silly to call Jews colonizers. And again, I want to make it clear. It is wrong to say that all Jews were colonizers because a lot of Jews opposed the colonization of Palestine. But using his own terms, he says it is wrong to call Zionist Jews colonizers because what they did was they found an empty land and then they modernized it, which is such a colonialist trope. Right? It is absurd. The terra nullius argument that there is like empty or wasted land that is ripe for improvement, or like Zionists themselves say today, like make the desert bloom, quote unquote. Like it was empty and we made it better, has its roots in John Locke and his theory of property, and like this is a very traditional hardliner colonial argument that indigenous peoples, because they don't meet the same kind of standard of using the land as Europeans do. There's no skyscrapers here, there's no factories here, so this land is being underutilized, this land is being wasted. Therefore, what you have is not real property and not a real social contract, so I can come in and take it from you. because you need guidance. You're not using your land well enough, so I can come in and teach you how to work the land and make it productive. Because my way of doing things, the quote unquote European way of doing things, is better than the quote Palestinian way of doing things because Palestinians are inferior. This is a classic colonial trope. And again, I want to make it clear this is what Bill Maher says, right? This is what it's in between the lines of his discourse. Right? What he's saying is it's silly to say that Zionist Jews are colonial because enter colonial trope. It's really weird. And it is very clear that in 1922, before the emergence of Israel, the League of Nations established a mandate in Palestine. And that mandate, as per the covenant of the League of Nations, was already provisionally recognized. That's an exact quote. It's provisionally recognized as an independent nation. So how can it be an orphaned province if by 1922 even Europe was already recognizing them as an independent nation? This is, of course, notwithstanding the fact that for centuries before that, the region had been called Palestine. The people living there had been called Palestinians, and there was a sense of regional membership. You see old maps; they say Palestine. It's like saying there never was a country called New York, therefore there are no New Yorkans. There's no sense of community between New Yorkers. It's absurd, right? So Europe themselves, like the colonial empires themselves, were saying, yeah, the people in Palestine must be provisionally recognized as an independent nation. And of course, because Maher essentially works with tropes, I'm sure that his response to this would be that the Mandate of Palestine was meant to become the national home for Jewish people. And I mean, that is true. The Mandate of Palestine, because of the Balfour Declaration, was supposed to become a national home to Jewish people around the world. You can agree or disagree, but that was what the text said. But the problem is that constructing this national home as some sort of like justification for ethnic cleansing and colonialism was something that not even the European empires of the time thought was reasonable or what the Balfour Declaration meant. So you can have the Balfour Declaration and still say ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is an absurd proposition because it would be entirely colonial and lead to suffering. And I mean, again, I'm not just saying this. There's documents involved in this. So you have, for example, this is the 1939 white paper by the UK. This was made by Britain. And I've highlighted some sections here for you to see. It says, like, it has been urged that the expression, a national home for the Jewish people, offered a prospect that Palestine might in due course become a Jewish state or commonwealth. Again, this is the British writing this. But, continues this white paper, but with the Royal Commission, His Majesty's government believed that the framers of the mandate in which the Balfour Declaration was embodied could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population of the country. Unauthorized statements have been made to the effect that the purpose in view is to create a wholly Jewish Palestine. Phrases have been used such as that Palestine is to become as Jewish as England is English. His Majesty's government regard any such expectation as impracticable and have no such aim in view. Nor have they at any time contemplated the disappearance or the subordination of the Arabic population, language, or culture in Palestine. They would draw attention to the fact that the terms of the Balfour Declaration referred to do not contemplate that Palestine as a whole should be converted into a Jewish national home, but that such a home should be founded in Palestine, all caps in Palestine. It is not part of their policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. Again, this is contemporary documents that say that's not the plan because that plan would require us to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, and that is impractical and wrong. This is the British Empire saying this. So the idea that this was empty land that was promised to Zionists so that they could turn this into a Jewish state, it's not just colonial, it is also not true that this is how it worked. It was entirely possible to conceive a Jewish national home in Palestine in the same way that the Flemish national home is in Belgium. And Belgium is not a Flemish country, or at least not an exclusively Flemish country. Belgium is a country that has Walloons and Flemish people, both living in peace, both coexistent, both with self-determination. So shall we continue with our video?
And the UN, we like them, right? Yeah, they agreed and voted a country for each of the indigenous peoples. One side agreed to that, but the Arabs had a slightly different proposal. They said, how about we keep it all and wipe you out?
Okay, this is another common trope in the pro-Israel discourse that I also find has little support in the historical record, or at least is highly contested, right, by historians themselves. So first of all, I think it's important to clarify, because this happened. This came up in the news recently because, like, Macron, the president of France, said that Israel should be more respectful of the UN because Israel was created through a UN resolution, and then Netanyahu went on a tirade and started attacking Macron. And I want to be clear that I actually don't agree with Macron. I don't think Israel was the result of a UN resolution. If Israel had been the result of a UN resolution, then the territory of Israel would be completely different. It would be the territory of the partition plan borders. And it's not, because Israel was not created out of compliance with, the partition borders. So Israel was instead the product of these Zionist individuals declaring that they were seceding from Palestine and creating a state through a war of ethnic cleansing. And so it is important to note, like, the creation of Israel and the start of what Ilan Pappé calls the phony war. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian, of course. And what Israelis call their war of independence, is not the beginning of Israeli independence. It is just a portion of a longer history. May 15 is the moment where, like, Israel is created, declared, and then in the traditional narrative of Israeli independence, the Arabs invaded and told the Palestinians, "You should leave, right? You should leave, and so that I can invade and kill all the Israelis." And so the Palestinians left and then lost the war and were not able to return. That's the normal Israeli discourse on this, which Bill Maher is reflecting. He says, like, there was a two-state solution, and one side said yes, the other side decided to invade to kill everyone. And that just changes how history happened, to be honest. Before 15th of May 1948, the Haganah, the Jewish defense forces that eventually became the IDF after joining forces with Irgun and Lihi, terrorist groups, Jewish terrorist groups, they had started way before, like 1947, the ethnic cleansing campaign. And this is widely reported in a very influential book, a really good book if you want to read it. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé. So by the time when Israeli narratives say, the Arab countries told the Palestinians to leave, most of Palestinians had already been ethnically cleansed. So this is a weird argument to make, right? This idea that, it was the Arabs that made the Palestinians leave, and they came in to kill every single Jew, and so they told the Palestinians to leave so that they could kill at will, right? And again, I want to make it clear, it's not me who says this. This is from Ilan Pappé's book. You have here what what Pape calls the consultancy. The consultancy is the group of people that were leading the efforts to ethnically cleanse Palestine in 1947 and before that even. So if you see here, it says that in a meeting on December 31st, 1947, Joseph Weitz, a member of this consultancy, member of this like Zionist leadership in Palestine, said, and this is the highlighted version, he said, "Is it not now the time to get rid of them? Why continue to keep in our midst those thorns at a time when they pose a danger to us?" He's talking, of course, about Arab Palestinians. This is 1947, right? So he continues and says, "Transfer," he had written in 1940, again, 1940, "does not serve only one aim, to reduce the Arab population. It also serves a secondary purpose by no means less important, which is to evict land now cultivated by Arabs and to free it for Jewish settlement. Therefore," he concluded, "the only solution is to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries. Not a single village or a single tribe must be let off." So if you go again to Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, here's what he writes about how the plan was implemented in March 1948. Remember, the key date, the day that the war, the phony war between Israel and the Arab nations started, was May 15th. So this is a month and a half before, in 1948. Right? He says, this is the highlighted version, the word cleansing, tihur, in Hebrew, was used economically in the consultancy's meetings, but appears on every order the high command passed down to the units on the ground. It means in Hebrew what it means in any other language, the expulsion of entire populations from their villages and from their towns. So again, this is not me saying this. This is what Israeli sources say in March 1948 that was happening. Right? So this idea that one side agreed, the other one didn't, and invaded, is sort of like a misrepresentation of history. First of all, Israel did not agree, because if it had agreed, it would have respected the borders of the Jewish state in the partition plan. Right? It didn't, because it was planning the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It was such an example of ethnic cleansing that when you start looking at the facts of what actually happened, the story starts getting very dark. So again, this is before May 15th, okay, before the start of the war. Yeah, in the context of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, one of the bigger problems, like massacres, atrocities that happened in that time, was the emptying of Haifa, traditionally Palestinian Arab city, where a lot of Palestinians lived. And Ilan Pape tells us that story, saying like Mordecai Maclef, the operation officer of the Carmeli Brigade, reading the highlighted version, called the shots. Maclef orchestrated the cleansing campaign, the Tihur campaign, and the orders he issued to his troops were plain and simple. Quotes, "Kill any Arab you encounter. Torch all inflammable objects and force doors open with explosives." He later became the Israeli army chief of staff. So in Haifa, you have, I'm continuing to read here, defenseless Palestinians headed towards the port where they hoped to find a ship or a boat to take them away from the city. As soon as they had fled, Jewish troops broke into and looted their houses. So you have the Haganah, the Israeli, what would eventually become the IDF, pushing people towards a port in Haifa. And then this happened. So I'm reading the highlighted part. The brigade's officers, aware that people had been advised to gather near the port's gate, ordered their men to station 3-inch mortars on the mountain slopes overlooking the market and the port, where people were, right? And to bombard the gathering crowds below, to guarantee that the flight would be in one direction only, so towards the sea. Right? So imagine this, like the level of callousness to bombard with mortars people fleeing ethnic cleansing. Right? So, continues Ilan Pape, scores of people stormed the boats that were moored there and began to flee. Men stepped on their friends and women on their own children. The boats in the port were soon filled with living cargo. The overcrowding in them was horrible. Many turned over and sank with all their passengers. So these people were literally thrown into the ocean to drown, chased by mortars. So it is ironic then when I hear people say, "Oh, the Arab armies invaded Israel to push every single Jew into the sea." While before this war started, that literally happened to Palestinians. Palestinians in Haifa were pushed into the sea by the advancing Haganah. So I find it quite amazing that this is just ignored. Okay. Okay, so shall we continue with the video, guys?
Chappell, if you think it was repressive growing up queer in the Midwest, try the Mideast. Chappell, you're not wrong that oppression is bad, or that Palestinian and many other Muslim populations are oppressed and deserve to be freed. You just have it completely ass backwards as to who is doing the oppressing. Hamas is a terrorist mafia that took over Gaza. The Revolutionary Guard is a terrorist mafia that took over Iran. ISIS is a terrorist mafia that took over Iraq. The Taliban is a terrorist mafia that took over Afghanistan. These are the oppressors. And when you make it all about Israel, you take the pressure off of them. You enable them. The Iranian regime has killed 600 protesters after a 22-year-old woman died in police custody following her arrest for the crime of wearing her head covering incorrectly. Just to be clear, that's your team.
Yeah, so again, this idea that that's your team, right? First of all, it's interesting to notice how Bill Maher grabs a nationalist group like Palestinian nationalist group like Hamas, a Sunni group like ISIS, a Persian group like the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, and a Pashto group like the Taliban, and goes like, "Oh, these are all the same. These are all on your team. That's your side. That's your team." Right? And I mean, it's these vastly different peoples, but because Maher approaches this from the perspective of Islam is evil, it's all the same to him. There's no difference, right? And you can of course criticize the crimes and the tactics that these groups have employed. Of course, like gender apartheid by the Taliban is horrendous and a human rights violation, and I'm glad that they're being taken to the International Court of Justice to address it. And of course, war crimes during October the 7th were horrible and should be prosecuted at the ICC, and Hamas leaders should be prosecuted at the ICC, although as far as we know at this point, like they've all been killed by Israel first. And of course, what ISIS did in Syria and Iraq was horrific, and there was a coalition of Arab nations to stop them militarily. So this like put them all in the same basket because they're all Islamic, they're all Muslims, and the Muslims are evil, is itself very problematic. Right? But it is even worse when he says that's your team, because again, we're talking about Chapel Roan. I saw the video that Bill Maher is referring to. She makes no reference to them. All she says is she sides with oppressive people, dressed as the Statue of Liberty. Right? So where is Bill Maher getting that Chapel Roan is a supporter of these groups? Right? So it is really mind blowing, and I think it's important to note that there's a technique at play here, and it's a very common technique where I come from. I'm, as you know, I'm Peruvian, and in Peru we have a term for this. In Peru, we use a term called terruco, like an abbreviated version of terrorista, to refer to people that are terrorists. And so you would refer to, like, for example, the Shining Path as the terrucos, los terrucos, right? And so eventually, as we as a society started processing the atrocities that our government committed and the atrocities that the Shining Path committed during the 1980s and 1990s, it suddenly became a convenient tactic of delegitimization to call people terruco when they were not. And it became so prevalent and so pervasive that it became a verb. It became a noun. In Peru, terruqueo, or in verb form, terruquear, is what you do when you want to delegitimize your opponent without ever engaging them on the merits by simply ascribing to them the quality of being a terrorist or a terrorist supporter. Right? So it is a specific technique in discourse to start calling your enemies terrorists. And the problem is that once you call someone a terrorist, terrorism is a word that is deeply securitized. So in IR, in international relations jargon, to securitize something is to turn that into a menace that requires forceful action. So terrorism is securitized. You do not talk with terrorists. I mean, in this prevailing narrative, like you don't quote unquote negotiate with terrorists, right? So what you're advocating when you call your rivals terrorists is to use violence against them, right? You're legitimizing using violence against your opponents. It's inevitable because if Chapel Roan is, according to Bill Maher, a terrorist or a terrorist supporter, then she's illegitimate and there's nothing to talk about, and she should essentially be excluded from society, if not worse, if not attacked, right? If not droned, if not like right now on Twitter, a lot of people are telling me like, oh, now that Israel has taken out the leader of Hamas, um, I really hope that the next target is academics like you. That's what people tell me on social media. Because this narrative of calling your rivals terrorists is inherently violent, and it is this trend, this discourse, in which Bill Maher is inserting himself, and he cannot escape that. If he is calling Chapel Roan a terrorist supporter, he is inserting what he's saying in a dangerous discourse and a radical discourse that leads to violence. Okay, so let's continue with the video, shall we?
Meryl Streep spoke at the UN recently and said this about the Taliban, who are only slightly more conservative than your heroes in Hamas. She said, "Today in Kabul, a female cat has more freedoms than a woman. A cat may go sit on her front stoop and feel the sun on her face. She may chase a squirrel into the park. A squirrel has more rights than a girl in Afghanistan today. A bird may sing in Kabul, but a girl may not." You're a singer, and you're advocating for a place and a culture you would never want to live under. Gender may not be binary, but right and wrong kind of is.
So, again, this is yet another Orientalist trope that we're seeing here, right? Like what Chapel Roan said was all oppressed people should be upheld. All oppressed people should be upheld. And Bill Maher is saying, look, what good and bad are objective, but they are objective in a binary where good happens in Israel, in the West, and bad happens in the Oriental world. Because he never considers or envisions that anything can be bad in Israel. Everything that is wrong, all the discriminations, happen only in the examples that he gave, the Muslim examples that he gave. But nothing bad can possibly happen in Israel, which is the shining city on a hill, the only democracy in the Middle East with the most moral army in the world. And I mean, that can't be right. That binary can't be right, right? Bad Muslim Israel good can't possibly be a binary that leads you to any kind of like rational or reasonable conclusion about the world. If good and bad are objectively decided, as he says, then he's doing a terrible job at it. What we are not agreeing on is what could possibly be wrong in Israel, right? And let's not even discuss the West Bank and Gaza for a second. Let's talk about Israel proper, this shining democracy in the middle of the Middle East, surrounded by enemies that want to destroy it. Let's look at that for a second. Right? This is what is known as the absentee property law in Israel. Okay, the absentee property law is a piece of legislation that was approved in 1948 through a military through military powers, through martial law. Right? I'm going to read you this text and then I'm going to explain what it is. This is the absentees property law. Included in its definition, Palestinians internally displaced peoples, numbering about 30,000 people in 1948. These people have been internally displaced from their villages and homes and had settled mostly in nearby Palestinian villages inside Israel. They were deemed absentees, quote unquote, even though they never crossed an international border and in many cases remained within a few kilometers of their homes and land. For example, Palestinians from Safuri settled in Nazareth, Palestinians from Malul settled in Jafar al-Nasira, and Palestinians from Ikrit settled in Al-Jish. These internally displaced peoples became known as the, quote, present absentees, which is the most incredibly ridiculous term I can think of. So what does this say? What is this? So when the Zionists, the colonial Zionists, were carrying out the ethnic displacement, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, this tihur in Plan Dalet that we just discussed. So at that time, whoever left their homes was named a absentee. Not whoever left Israel. Whoever left their homes and was Palestinian. So if you lived in Haifa and you were shot at with mortars and you went to the port, you somehow survived, and then you returned to your neighbor's house, not to your normal place of residence, you're an absentee. You're a present absentee. And as a present absentee, even though you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you are quote unquote equal under the law, supposedly, because it's a democracy, supposedly, you still don't have right to that property because you're absent, even though you're present. So that property that you left, even though you still live in the country, can be taken from you by the government and granted to a Jewish citizen of Israel. Think of the absurdity. You are there in Israel, but because you're a Palestinian and because you left your land while you were trying to be ethnically cleansed, you lose your right to the property you left. And again, this is not all, right? There's more. So this is from the same report. Okay, this relates to family separation policies, meaning what happens when Palestinians, because of the ethnic cleansing, ended up with divided between the West Bank and Israel proper. So it says, since 2002, Israel has adopted a policy of prohibiting Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza from gaining status in Israel or East Jerusalem through marriage. And also through religious conversion, by the way. A Palestinian from the West Bank cannot convert to Judaism to gain the right to Aliyah into Israel. It continues, the law barred thousands of Palestinians in Israel and East Jerusalem from living there with their Palestinian spouses from the West Bank and Gaza. Israel's then Interior Minister stated that the law was needed because, quote, it was felt that family unification would be exploited to achieve a creeping right of return. So because Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, if you allow Palestinians that live inside of Israel to marry Palestinians that live in the West Bank and then give a visa to the people that are in the West Bank to live in Israel proper, then that would return the ethnically cleansed Palestinians. And you cannot possibly have that. So it's banned. Right? So it continues, says, the highlighted version says, when the Israeli government lost the vote to extend the law in July 2021, it signaled its intent to nonetheless maintain the policy. By contrast, the 2003 law explicitly did not apply to residents of Jewish settlements in the West Bank wanting to marry and live with their spouses inside of Israel. So essentially, if you are Israeli and you are Jewish and you live in Israel proper and you want to marry an Israeli Jew that lives in the settlements in the West Bank, you can do that. But if you are an Israeli Palestinian who wants to marry a Palestinian who lives in the West Bank, you cannot. I mean, let me rephrase. You can marry them. You cannot live with them. You need to do long distance. Long distance across a checkpoint, basically. How can you possibly call that democratic? How is this not racial segregation and racial discrimination? Of course, it is. But of course, we never discuss this. Because in Bill Maher's binary, if it's in Israel, it's good, it's civilized, it's developed, it's European, or it's like Western. And if it's Palestinian, it's Islamic, therefore savage and barbarian. That is the messed up binary that he's espousing here. Why isn't this in his list of horrible things that happen in the Middle East? Because it happens in Israel. That's his binary. So when he says right and wrong are binary, he doesn't mean right or wrong are binary in the sense of what's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. He means what's right is right, especially because if it's in Israel, it's right, and what's wrong is whatever is Islamic. Okay, we're coming up towards the final part of the stream, so let's go back to the video, shall we?
Now, first off, the fact that you don't know much history isn't your fault. You live in the United States, where the schools stopped doing that whole teaching facts thing a while ago. But getting all your history from TikTok is like getting all your calories from Hostess.
Right. So this is, if it sounded familiar, it's because I brought it from earlier. This is where we started, where we began. And it made me think about, like, where are we getting our histories? Where does history come from? That's the question at stake here, because we've seen throughout this, engagement with discourse that history is not being told. The certain documents are not being shown, and instead we get a little bit of like commonplace arguments that keep reappearing every now and then, here and there, right? The Palestinians left voluntarily, Israel is a democracy, etc., etc. So where is it that we are getting our history? Where is it that we're getting our knowledge? It's actually a pretty post-colonial argument to make. It's a thing that post-colonial scholars engage with a lot. And it is ironic, it is highly ironic that Bill Maher is chastising Chaperon for not educating herself, when really what Bill Maher is doing is repeating very basic factoids that I'm sure he's come across throughout his life, but that have little support in history. Or at the very least, he should not talk about with this level of security as if like, oh, I'm teaching you because I'm the one who knows and you don't. What he has is commonplace arguments. What he has is cliches. He hasn't taken the trouble of going through the actual historical scholarship to discover, at the very least, discover the huge debate that exists in Israel proper, and the consensus that exists outside of Israel about what happened in 1948 and why we talk about 1948 and before 1948 as colonization and of Zionism as a colonial endeavor. Right. So I wanted to share with you one final image. This is from Ilan Pape's book. So to see where this debate is coming and where is it that we're getting our history? Where is Bill Maher getting his history? So I'm going to read the highlighted parts again. Okay, it says, this is again Ilan Pape speaking. One of the best known figures writing on the subject of 1948 was the Israeli historian Benny Morris. See, I told you I would come to Benny Morris. Morris ended up with a very partial picture of what happened on the ground. Still, this was enough for some of his Israeli readers to realize that the, quote, voluntary flight of the Palestinians had been a myth, and that the Israeli self-image of having waged, quote, moral war in 1948 against the, quote, primitive and hostile Arab world was considerably flawed and possibly already bankrupt. The picture was partial because Morris took the Israeli military reports he found in the archives at face value and even as absolute truth. Palestinian sources show clearly how months before the entry of Arab forces into Palestine, and while the British were still responsible for law and order in the country, the Jewish forces had already succeeded in forcibly expelling almost 250,000 Palestinians. Had Morris and others used Arab sources or turned to oral history, they might have been able to get a better grasp of the systematic planning behind the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948 and provide a more truthful description of the enormity of the crimes the Israeli soldiers committed. And I mean, this is not controversial. There's a documentary called Tantura that deals with this and interviews the very soldiers that committed these atrocities. And they openly say, we committed war crimes, we killed people, we committed atrocities. Why is it, therefore, that all of this is hidden? Because of what I was saying at the beginning, where when you put the West first as the most important source of knowledge, the alpha and omega of knowledge, including Israel in the West, then of course you're going to read Israeli sources, you're going to take them at face value, and things that aren't in the archive, like Palestinian oral histories, testimony, like Palestinian historians' work, that's left out. That's not there. And so the Palestinian version of facts gets erased because they are not in the quote acceptable formats that Bill Maher wants, which is an Israeli archive that then gets translated into a textbook that then gets taught to kids when they're in primary school, and then they never open another book until they have their own show in HBO and they say the things that they say. Right? But this common understanding of how history works is biased and problematic because it is based on a way of producing knowledge that it is Western-centric, where Palestinian histories and Palestinian stories and the ways that Palestinians remember their own history is neglected. So this is not just an Israeli problem. This is a global problem. The way that we produce knowledge is Eurocentric. Okay, so I guess this is the main point, right? That Bill Maher is coming at this from the perspective of his own history and not caring about histories that aren't his own. And so at the end, he's just repeating propaganda and commonplaces and calling them history.